I mean, the two dimes represent 20 games, right?
Yeah.
So, in a way, that's what they were for. And I haven't added a third one, shooting for 30, but I still use the two dimes every time I pitch.
Yeah.
I'm not a great fan. I'm just a person who's suffering under those conditions.
I think kids are just going through the motion of playing the game and don't understand why they do what they do. There's a method to this madness of advancing the runner. There's a method to this madness of throwing strikes.
The dark truth behind Vida Blue is something even his ex-wife could not keep quiet about forever. This baseball legend went from national hero to infamous criminal, and the story of how it happened reveals a side of sports history nobody wants to talk about. How does a young pitcher who dominated an entire league end up in federal prison with a cocaine scandal that destroyed his legacy? I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Vida Blue was supposed to be untouchable. In 1971, at just 21 years old, he became the youngest MVP in American League history, while also winning the Cy Young Award. He was on magazine covers everywhere. He was the face of baseball. He was making the Oakland Athletics millions of dollars in ticket sales and merchandise. But behind the cameras and the cheering crowds, something much darker was building inside him. Quick thing, if you are into these deep dive stories about the real lives behind the legends, tap the hype feature and throw some hype on this video. It really helps this series grow and lets me keep digging into stories like this one. The truth is, Vida Blue felt like a product from day one, not a person. He would later describe the pressure and exploitation that turned his dream career into a nightmare he could not escape. And that nightmare eventually led to a federal courtroom, a prison sentence, and a lifetime of struggling with addiction and legal trouble that followed him until his death. His ex-wife, Peggy Shannon, would later open up about what life with him was really like behind closed doors, and it painted a picture nobody expected. The public saw a charming superstar who lit up every room he walked into. The private reality was a man drowning in bitterness, anger, and eventually substance abuse that controlled his life. This is not just a story about baseball. This is a story about exploitation, mental health, racism in professional sports, and how the system failed a young black athlete who was never given the support he desperately needed. It all started in Mansfield, Louisiana, a small, segregated town where Vida Blue was the oldest of 6 children. His father worked as a laborer and provided a stable home despite modest income. Vida showed exceptional talent early, excelling in both baseball and football at DeSoto High School. Colleges noticed him. The University of Houston wanted him as a quarterback. So did Notre Dame and Purdue. This was a big deal because black quarterbacks were extremely rare in major college programs at that time. Football was his true passion. He loved it more than baseball. But then, tragedy struck during his senior year. His father died suddenly. The loss created an immediate financial crisis. Now Vida was the oldest child in a family with no father and very little money. His mother had 5 younger siblings to care for with no safety net. College football would give him a scholarship covering education and living expenses. But scholarships do not put food on the table back home or pay bills for younger brothers and sisters. The Kansas City Athletics offered him a professional baseball contract with a $12,500 signing bonus and a 2-year deal. To a family in rural Louisiana struggling to survive, that money was life-changing. Vida later said it felt like $1 trillion. So he gave up football and signed with the Athletics to support his family. He was 17 years old and already carrying the weight of being the breadwinner for 6 people. That burden would shape everything that came after. Vida tore through the minor leagues with dominant performances and made his major league debut in 1969. By 1970, he was showing flashes of the dominance that would define his peak. Then came 1971, and that season changed everything in baseball. He went 24-8 with a league-leading 1.82 earned run average. He struck out 301 batters. He threw 8 shutouts and 24 complete games. He pitched over 312 innings. His whip was 0.952, which was the best in the American League. He was not just good. He was the best pitcher in baseball by a wide margin, and the numbers proved it beyond any doubt. He won both the MVP and the Cy Young Award in the same season, becoming the youngest player in the 20th century to win the MVP. He was only 21 years old. Suddenly, Vida Blue was everywhere in American culture. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was on Sports Illustrated. Major brands wanted him for endorsements. Fans across the country were packing stadiums just to watch him pitch, even in road games. The media called it Blue Mania, and it was unlike anything baseball had seen in years. He was a phenomenon. But Blue Mania came with a psychological cost nobody talked about. Vida was 21 years old and had gone from a small town to being the most famous athlete in America almost overnight. There was no transition period, no support system to help him handle the pressure, no sports psychologist, no mentor, no one to teach him how to navigate the media or the business side. He later said he felt more like a product than a person, and that feeling ate away at him. The Oakland Athletics were using his name and face to sell tickets and merchandise everywhere. Team owner Charlie Finley was making a fortune off Blue Mania, but Vida himself was being paid just $14,750 for the entire 1971 season. He was the league MVP, the most dominant pitcher in baseball, and he was barely making enough to live on. Meanwhile, the team was raking in millions because of him. The disparity planted seeds of resentment that would grow into something much darker. After the 1971 season ended, Vida and his attorney Robert Gerst asked for a raise to $92,500. That was not outrageous, given he had just won the two biggest awards in baseball. But Charlie Finley refused. Finley was known for being cheap and willing to humiliate players to maintain power. He offered just $50,000 and would not budge. The negotiations became public and deeply personal. During one meeting, Finley reportedly acknowledged that Vida deserved the money, but then smiled and said, "I ain't gonna give it to you." That moment crushed something inside Vida. It was about respect and being treated like a human being. Finley was making it clear he did not respect Vida as a person. The racial dynamics made it worse. Vida later recalled that Finley treated him like a colored boy. Finley was a wealthy white owner with all the leverage. Vida was a young black athlete in the early 1970s, trying to stand up for himself in a system designed to keep him powerless. Finley used that imbalance to his advantage. He even tried to force Vida to change his name, offering $2,000 to legally change his middle name to True for marketing purposes. Vida refused because his name was important to him and his family. But Finley told stadium announcers and press staff to use True Blue anyway. It was another way of stripping away his identity and turning him into a marketing tool. The situation escalated. To pressure Vida into signing, Finley released Tommy Davis, a veteran teammate who had helped Vida find his lawyer. Davis was punished just for helping a young player stand up for himself. The message was clear. If you try to fight back, people around you will suffer. Vida felt trapped and guilty. He briefly retired and took a job selling bathroom and kitchen fixtures to escape the toxic environment. Eventually, he signed a new contract for $63,000 and returned for the 1972 season. But the damage was done. His love for baseball had been poisoned, and the bitterness toward Finley never went away. Things got even worse in 1976 when Finley decided to blow up the dynasty. Free agency was coming to baseball, and owners were losing their grip on players. Finley knew he would lose control of his championship roster, so he decided to sell his best players for cash before that happened. In June 1976, Finley negotiated to sell Vida to the Yankees for $1.5 million. He also tried to sell Joe Rudy and Raleigh Fingers to Boston for $2 million. These were straight cash sales, not trades. Commissioner Bowie Kuhn vetoed the deals under the best interests of baseball clause. Finley sued, but the courts upheld the decision. For Vida, the situation was dehumanizing. His owner had tried to sell him for $1.5 million, but Vida would not see a penny of it. He was treated as a liquid asset, and even though the sale was blocked, Vida was stuck in Oakland with an owner who clearly valued him as nothing more than a dollar sign. The veto trapped him in an environment where he felt disrespected every day. Teammates noticed the change. He became withdrawn and bitter. The psychological toll was mounting with no outlet. The media did not help the situation at all. When Vida held out for more money in 1972, many reporters turned on him viciously and called him greedy and selfish. They ignored the fact that he was being paid a tiny fraction of what he was actually worth to the franchise. They ignored the exploitation and the racial dynamics at play. Instead, they painted him as a spoiled athlete who wanted too much money and did not appreciate what he had. This narrative added to his isolation and made him feel even more alone. He had lost his father years earlier, so he did not have a paternal figure or mentor to help him navigate the pressures of fame and the brutal ugliness of the business side of professional sports. Tommy Davis had been released as punishment for helping him, so that potential mentor was gone too. Vida was alone in ways that most people could not understand. and the weight of everything he was carrying was slowly crushing him from the inside out. By the early 1980s, the bitterness, pressure, and unresolved trauma had taken a serious toll on Vida's mental health and his ability to cope. He had developed a dependency on cocaine, which became his way of dealing with everything he had been through over more than a decade. In 1983, while playing for the Kansas City Royals after leaving Oakland, federal investigators caught him in a drug sting operation. Vida, along with teammates Willie Wilson, Jerry Martin, and Willie Aikens, pleaded guilty to attempting to purchase cocaine from undercover agents. This was part of a much larger federal investigation into drug use throughout Major League Baseball, and it eventually led to the infamous Pittsburgh drug trials in 1985, where numerous star players testified about widespread cocaine use in the sport. But Vida and his 3 Kansas City teammates were the ones who faced the harshest legal consequences because they were caught in the actual act of attempting to buy drugs. Vida was sentenced to 90 days in federal prison. He also received a 1-year suspension from baseball for the entire 1984 season. The scandal destroyed his reputation overnight. Suddenly, the same media outlets that had celebrated him during Blue Mania were now tearing him apart and calling him a disgrace to the game. He went from being remembered as the face of baseball in 1971 to being labeled a criminal and a cautionary tale about drug abuse. The federal government made a very public example out of him, prioritizing high-profile arrests and harsh sentencing over any consideration for rehabilitation or understanding the root causes of addiction. Vida later said in interviews that the scandal and the prison sentence likely cost him a spot in the Baseball Hall of Fame, which was something he desperately wanted as validation for his career achievements. He finished his playing days with 209 career wins and statistics that matched or exceeded many players who were already inducted into the Hall. His 1971 season alone should have been enough to earn serious consideration. But voters could not get past the stigma of the cocaine case and the federal prison time. He was bitter about that rejection for the rest of his life. And he had a point when he argued that plenty of other flawed players were already in the Hall of Fame. Many of them had serious character issues or had broken rules, but they had not been criminalized in such a public way. Vida believed he was being singled out and punished more harshly because his mistakes had led to a federal conviction that the media covered extensively. In 1989, several years after his playing career ended, Vida tried to rebuild his life and find some stability. He married Peggy Shannon in a high-profile ceremony at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, which was a symbolic location because he had pitched there for years with the Giants. The wedding was a major spectacle, covered by local media. Giants players held an arc of bats for the couple to walk under as they left the ceremony. Baseball legends like Willie McCovey and Orlando Cepeda attended as guests. It looked like the beginning of a redemption story. A fresh start where the troubled athlete finally found happiness, stability, and a chance to leave his past behind. But the reality behind the scenes was far more complicated and painful than what the public saw. Peggy Shannon later opened up in interviews about what life with Vida was really like on a day-to-day basis. She described him as having a vibrant and likable personality whenever he was in public settings. He was charming, magnetic, and funny. He was the kind of person who could light up any room just by walking into it. People were drawn to him naturally, but in private, away from the cameras and the crowds, Shannon saw a completely different side of him. She witnessed a man who was struggling with deep psychological issues that he had never fully addressed or dealt with in any meaningful way. His entire social life revolved around drinking, which was extremely dangerous for someone with a documented history of substance abuse and addiction. People loved being around Vida Blue. They wanted to buy him drinks at events and social functions. They wanted to be able to say they had a beer with the famous pitcher. And Vida had a very hard time saying no to those offers, even when saying no would have been the healthier choice for his long-term sobriety and well-being. Shannon witnessed the split between his public persona and his private reality up close for years. She saw a man who was still carrying the enormous weight of everything that had happened to him over the course of his career and his life. The exploitation by Charlie Finley, the racism he had endured, the feeling of being treated like a product instead of a person, the federal prison sentence, and the public humiliation of the cocaine scandal, the rejection by Hall of Fame voters. All of that trauma was still inside him, unresolved and eating away at him. And it affected their marriage in ways that eventually became unbearable for Shannon. She tried to help him, but the damage was too deep and too old. The issues had been festering for decades without proper treatment or support. The marriage did not last. It ended in divorce, adding another loss to the long list of losses Vida had experienced throughout his life. Shannon later became publicly known for being a complainant in a separate high-profile sexual harassment case against San Diego Mayor Bob Filner, which showed that her life after Vida continued to be marked by proximity to power struggles and public conflict. For Vida, the end of the marriage was devastating. He was isolated again. He was alone again. And the mental health issues he had struggled with since his early 20s were still completely unresolved. He had no real tools to deal with them. The system had never provided him with therapy or counseling or any kind of meaningful support for his psychological trauma. In the mid-2000s, Vida faced yet another very public downfall that made headlines. He was arrested multiple times for driving under the influence of alcohol. These DUI arrests happened years after his playing career had ended, and they were a clear sign that the substance abuse issues from the 1980s had never truly gone away or been resolved. Analysts and people who knew him described these incidents as the ripple effect of decades of untreated mental health problems combined with the lingering shame and stigma from his 1983 federal conviction and prison sentence. For someone who had once been the most famous athlete in the entire world, the transition to a retired life without the structure, purpose, and identity that came from playing baseball was incredibly difficult to navigate. The arrests were embarrassing and painful. They were public reminders that his demons were still following him and that he was still struggling with the same issues that had derailed his career in the first place. Despite all of these struggles and setbacks, Vida tried hard to rebuild his reputation and reconnect with the baseball community during his later years. He became a community ambassador for the San Francisco Giants, which was a role that allowed him to interact with fans and represent the organization at public events. He also worked as a television analyst, providing commentary and insights during game broadcasts. He used his natural charisma and his magnetic personality to reconnect with fans who remembered his greatness on the field during the 1970s. Many people were willing to give him a second chance and forgive his past mistakes. But even during this period of attempted redemption, people who were close to him remained deeply concerned about his lifestyle and his ongoing struggles. They noticed that his social life still involved situations and environments where people wanted to buy him drinks to celebrate being around a famous athlete. Those temptations were constantly present, and they were constantly undermining his efforts to stay sober and maintain the progress he had made. It was a vicious cycle that he could never fully escape, no matter how hard he tried. The real tragedy of Vida Blue's story is not just what happened to him, but why it happened and how easily it could have been prevented. He was a young man from a small, segregated town in Louisiana who gave up his true dream of playing football to support his family financially after his father died. He entered professional baseball out of economic necessity, not pure passion or love for the game. Then he became the most dominant pitcher in baseball at the impossibly young age of 21. And instead of being celebrated, supported, and protected, he was systematically exploited by an owner who saw him as nothing more than a product to be marketed and controlled. Charlie Finley refused to pay him anything close to what he was worth. Finley forced a nickname on him that he had explicitly rejected. Finley tried to sell him like property for $1.5 million without his input. The media turned on him when he asked for fair compensation, framing him as greedy instead of recognizing the exploitation. And the sports world of the 1970s offered absolutely no mental health support, no guidance, and no protection for a young black athlete trying to navigate sudden fame, intense pressure, and systemic racism. By the time Vida turned to cocaine in the early 1980s as a way to cope with everything, he had already been dealing with bitterness, isolation, trauma, and exploitation for over a decade. The federal investigation and the prison sentence were just the final chapter of a much longer private collapse that had been building since 1971. And even after serving his time and trying to rebuild his reputation and his life, the stigma followed him everywhere. He was denied entry to the Hall of Fame, despite statistics and achievements that clearly warranted induction. He faced more legal trouble with the DUI arrests in the 2000s. His marriage to Peggy Shannon fell apart. He spent his final years working hard to reconcile his past with his present, and to show that he was more than just the sum of his mistakes and his worst moments. Vida Blue died in 2023 at the age of 73 from complications related to cancer. His death marked the end of one of the most complicated, tragic, and polarizing stories in the entire history of baseball. He was a three-time World Series champion with the Oakland Athletics, an integral part of a dynasty that won titles in 1972, 1973, and 1974, and dominated baseball for half a decade. But he was also the primary victim of that dynasty's internal toxicity, corruption, and exploitation. The sports world of the 1970s was simply not equipped to handle the human needs of its black superstars, or to recognize them as people deserving of dignity and support. Vida was economically exploited by Charlie Finley, who treated him like a slave. He was commodified by the media, who turned on him the moment he stood up for himself. And he was ultimately criminalized by a federal justice system that cared far more about making headlines and securing high-profile convictions than about rehabilitation, mental health treatment, or addressing the root causes of addiction. In his final years, during the few interviews he gave, Vida spent time reflecting on what could have been and what should have been. He genuinely believed that if Charlie Finley had simply treated him with basic human respect and paid him fairly for the value he generated, his entire life would have been different. He believed he would have reached the Hall of Fame without question. He thought he might have even become the first black pitcher in baseball history to win 30 games in a single season, which would have been a monumental achievement. Instead, his career and his life were defined far more by what he lost than by what he achieved. He was bitter about that reality, and he had every right to be bitter. The system failed him at every single turn. When he asked for fair pay, he was denied and humiliated. When he struggled with the psychological weight of sudden fame, there was no support system in place. When he turned to drugs as a coping mechanism for years of trauma, he was prosecuted and sent to prison, instead of being offered treatment and help. And when he tried to rebuild and find redemption in his later years, the stigma followed him and prevented him from receiving the recognition he deserved for his on-field achievements. Peggy Shannon's willingness to talk openly and honestly about the private reality of their life together gave the world a much more complete and nuanced picture of who Vida Blue really was as a person. He was not just a troubled athlete who made bad choices. He was not just a criminal who deserved everything that happened to him. He was a deeply complex human being who had been carrying unimaginable trauma since he was a teenager. He was someone who felt like a product instead of a person from the moment Blue Mania started. He was charming and magnetic in public settings, where people expected him to perform, but he was haunted by bitterness, anger, and unresolved pain in his private life. The drinking, the cocaine, the DUIs, all of it was symptomatic of a much deeper struggle with mental health and trauma that nobody in the baseball world or the federal justice system had ever properly addressed or tried to help him heal from. The question that should hang over Vida Blue's story for future generations is this: what responsibility does the professional sports industry have to protect and genuinely support its young athletes, especially those who come from difficult economic circumstances and achieve sudden, overwhelming fame before they are emotionally ready to handle it? Vida Blue was 21 years old when Blue Mania hit and turned him into a national icon overnight. He had no father to guide him through it, because his father had died when he was still in high school. He had no real support system in place because the athletics organization saw him as a revenue generator, not as a vulnerable young man who needed help. And he had an owner, Charlie Finley, who viewed him as nothing more than a commodity to exploit for maximum profit. The pressure of all of that destroyed him slowly over the course of decades, and by the time people around him realized how serious the psychological damage was, it was already far too late to undo it or to help him recover. His story should serve as a permanent cautionary tale about what happens when raw talent and sudden fame intersect with systemic exploitation, racism, and a complete absence of mental health resources or institutional support. Vida Blue made serious mistakes during his life. Nobody disputes that fact. The cocaine case was real, the guilty plea was real, and documented in federal court records. The prison time was real, the DUI arrests were real. He broke laws, and he faced legal consequences for those actions. But those consequences and those mistakes have to be understood within the full context of everything that led up to them over many years. A young man who felt worthless and bitter after being systematically exploited by his employer. A young man who was treated like property rather than like a person with dignity and rights. A young man who had no outlet for the trauma, isolation, and psychological pain he was experiencing every single day. That young man turned to drugs as a way to cope with unbearable pressure and unresolved mental health issues. It does not excuse the illegal behavior or make the consequences go away, but it does explain how and why it happened. And it raises serious moral questions about accountability and responsibility. Should the primary focus be entirely on punishing Vida Blue for his personal mistakes? Or should at least some of that focus also be directed at the people the systems, and the institutions that created the conditions for those mistakes to happen in the first place. The federal drug investigation that led to Vida's arrest in 1983 was part of a much larger effort by law enforcement and baseball's leadership to combat widespread cocaine use throughout Major League Baseball during that era. Other major star players, including Keith Hernandez, Tim Raines, and Dave Parker, were also publicly implicated in drug use during the Pittsburgh drug trials that followed. Many players testified about their own cocaine use and about the culture of drug use that existed in clubhouses across the league. But despite all of that testimony and all of those admissions, Vida Blue and his 3 Kansas City Royals teammates bore the brunt of the actual criminal sentencing and prison time. They went to federal prison, while many other players who admitted to the same behavior testified in court and then walked away without facing similar consequences. There was clearly an element of selective prosecution in how the federal case was handled, and Vida was very aware of that disparity. He believed he was being made an example of by prosecutors who wanted a high-profile conviction to send a message. And the lifetime stigma that followed him after his release from prison seemed to confirm that belief in his mind. The Hall of Fame debate surrounding Vida Blue is especially painful and complicated when you look at the full context. He finished his playing career with 209 wins, which is a significant achievement. He won the Cy Young Award, which is given to the best pitcher in the league. He won the MVP award, which is given to the best overall player. He was selected to 6 All-Star games. His 1971 season was, objectively, one of the most dominant single-season pitching performances in the entire history of baseball. And the statistics back that up beyond any doubt. By any reasonable standard of evaluation, those credentials should be more than enough for induction into the Hall of Fame. But voters could not and would not separate the player from the scandal. They saw the cocaine conviction. They saw the federal prison time, and they decided that Vida Blue did not deserve the honor of induction, regardless of what he had accomplished on the field. He was deeply, deeply hurt by that rejection. It felt like one more punishment on top of all the others. He pointed out in interviews that plenty of players who were already in the Hall of Fame had serious character flaws, personal issues, and moral failings. Some of them had been involved in gambling. Some of them had been violent or abusive. Some of them had been racist. But they were not being judged by the same harsh standard that was being applied to him. The difference was that his flaws and his mistakes had been criminalized in a very public federal case that received extensive media coverage, while other players had managed to keep their issues private or had simply never faced legal consequences for their behavior. If there is one clear lesson that should be taken from the life and the tragedy of Vida Blue, it is this: talent alone is never enough to protect someone from exploitation, harm, and systemic failure. Young athletes, especially those who come from marginalized communities and difficult economic circumstances, desperately need support structures that go far beyond contracts and paychecks. They need mentorship from people who have navigated similar pressures before. They need access to mental health resources and therapy to process trauma. They need protection from owners and organizational systems that view them as expendable assets rather than as human beings with dignity and rights. Vida Blue never had any of those things during the most critical years of his life and career. He had undeniable talent. He had fame. He had pressure. But he did not have support. And without that support system in place, the pressure eventually broke him in ways that could never be fully repaired. His resilience and determination during his later years showed very clearly that he was still capable of growth, change, and redemption, even after everything he had been through. He worked extremely hard to overcome his reputation as a troubled figure and a cautionary tale. He reconnected with baseball fans through his work with the Giants and his television appearances. He tried to be honest and open about his struggles, in the hope that sharing his story might help other people avoid making similar mistakes, or might help them understand the importance of mental health support. That effort matters. It shows that Vida Blue should not be defined solely by his worst moments or his biggest mistakes. He was a deeply complex human being who experienced extraordinary highs and devastating lows during his life. And he spent his final years genuinely trying to make peace with both sides of that story. The confessions and revelations from Peggy Shannon and others who knew him intimately provide a much fuller and more honest picture of that complexity. They show a man who was just as vulnerable as he was dominant on the mound. They reveal the deep, private pain that existed behind the public charm and charisma. And they remind all of us that professional athletes are not just performers who exist for our entertainment or our judgment. They are real people with real psychological struggles, real trauma, and real human needs. When we as a society and as a sports culture fail to recognize that basic truth, we create the conditions where people like Vida Blue inevitably fall through the cracks and suffer in ways that could have been prevented. So what is the real dark truth of Vida Blue's life when you strip away all the myths and the headlines? It is that the same system that was designed to celebrate his talent and his achievements also systematically destroyed him as a person. It is that the same industry that made him famous and wealthy refused to support him or protect him when he needed help the most. It is that his ex-wife and the other people closest to him saw the reality behind the carefully crafted public persona and understood that his struggles were not just personal moral failures, but were actually the direct result of years and years of economic exploitation, racial discrimination, psychological neglect, and institutional indifference. And it is that despite everything that happened to him, despite all the pain and all the losses, he never stopped trying. He kept fighting to rebuild his life. He kept working to reconnect with the fans who remembered his greatness. And he kept searching for some kind of redemption and peace before the end finally came. Vida Blue was not a perfect man by any measure. He made choices during his life that hurt himself and that hurt other people around him. But he was also undeniably a victim of a sports system that chewed him up and spit him out without any regard for his humanity or his long-term well-being. His story deserves to be told in its full complexity, not just the highlights of Blue Mania, and not just the scandal of the cocaine conviction, but everything that happened in between and everything that came before and after. The world saw the phenomenon of Blue Mania in 1971. The world saw the cocaine conviction and the prison sentence in 1983. What the world did not see was the young man carrying the enormous weight of supporting his entire family after his father died. What the world did not see was the systematic exploitation by Charlie Finley and the racial dynamics that made it even worse. What the world did not see was the isolation, the bitterness, and the complete lack of mental health support that could have changed absolutely everything about how his story ended. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button. Subscribe to Baseball Icons so we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the real, untold stories behind the legends of the game. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you think about this case. Does Vida Blue deserve forgiveness for what happened? Should he be in the Hall of Fame, despite the cocaine scandal and everything that followed? Should the system that exploited him share some of the blame for his downfall? These are genuinely tough questions without easy answers, and I want to hear your perspective and your take on all of it. Thanks for watching this one, and I will see you in the next video.